What we want to do today, we want to pick up where we stopped last time. If you'll remember, we were talking about the modern quantity theory of money. If you remember, there was the classical economists had their quantity theory of money. That was the original version of it, MV equals PQ. And they had certain assumptions that they made, that velocity was constant and that the real GDP was constant, although they didn't have that measure of GDP at the time. But they assumed that real GDP was constant. And so then all they really had was, this is the money supply. They were saying that if the money supply would double, then, gosh, there's only one other thing in the equation that can change. The price level would have to double. The consumer price index, the GDP price deflator, and so forth. And so that was the classical economist version of this. And I've written it down here. That's really where I'm going with this, is that in the modern quantity theory of money, when you see the M in there, it doesn't stand for money supply. It stands for money demand. And so let me come back and do what I did the other day. MV equals PQ. And this is the classic, or the modern version of the quantity theory of money. What they did is this. They switched the V over to the other side of the formula, 1 over V times, rather than PQ, let's put in GDP. That's nominal GDP price times a quantity. And then rather than leave it as 1 over V, they use the letter K times GDP. And this is just a proportion or a fraction, proportion. Like, for example, it might be 0.2, and that's just an example. But anyway, and then this M is money demand. And so in the modern quantity theory of money, they have a formula that basically says this: money demand is proportional to economic activity or income. GDP is basically income for everybody in the United States as well as what gets produced. So there's two different ways of looking at it. But basically what this says is money demand is proportional to income. And so if your income was, under these circumstances, $10,000, and this K was 0.2, then what we would say is my money demand is, what would this be, $2,000. In my checking account and in currency in my pocket, I like to hold $2,000. That's what this approach would say. And so, boy, they've really come a long ways from talking about money supply over to now money demand. Come a long ways, but it took some time to do it. This is like 50s until the present. And this stuff, this classical version of the quantity theory of money, this is going back a couple hundred years or even further really, and coming forward until roughly the 1950s. There's no like certain date here that I've got in mind, but this is the more modern version of this. Now, let's draw a curve to go along with it, because you know economists cannot go very far without drawing a curve. And we'll put dollars up here, money, and down here GDP, or income, if you like. Again, this is nominal GDP, not real. Okay. And so what we have is this money demand line. Money demand is proportional to GDP. And the slope of this curve is equal to K. And so if K is 0.2, as it was a moment ago in my discussion, then the slope of the curve is equal to 0.2. Meaning what? Meaning if you go over by 1 unit, you would go up by 0.2 units, or over by 10 units, up by 2. Okay? So this is the money demand equation from the modern quantity theory of money. Now, we have to do something else. We have to put in the money supply. So let me draw a curve right here. It shows money supply. And you recall we're talking about the M1 money supply, which is currency plus checking deposits. And I'll take that down here in just a second, but I just wanted to remind you what kind of money we're talking about. Not just the currency in your pocket, but also your checking account money. Okay, well, here's basically where we're headed with all this. If we find the point where money supply equals money demand, this is GDP, and I'll put an E down there for equilibrium. We've established an equilibrium GDP for the economy. So we've got that money demand equation. Let me write an equation for the money supply. Money supply is just whatever the Federal Reserve sets it at, and I'll put a little bar over that to show a fixed amount. So we've got an equation for money supply and money demand. Here's a third equation, an equilibrium condition, and I'll write that over here, equilibrium condition. This has got to be satisfied for the world to work out right. Money supply equals money demand. You don't have equilibrium in the money market, in the quantity of money, unless money supply equals money demand. And now what I want to do is write a different version. I'll call this 3' on this equation. Money supply equals, I'm going to substitute for money demand, this thing we had up here, KGDP. That's the equilibrium condition. And the equilibrium condition of money supply equals money demand, or money supply equals that proportion K times GDP, that is what we see in this diagram right here. This intersection of the two curves coming together, money supply and money demand, that's where we get equilibrium in the economy. Now, let's take just a couple minutes and talk about and see what happens if things don't work out the way I'm saying. Let's suppose that we do have this money demand line and with the slope of 0.2, and suppose we do have this money supply, and I mean this could be like $1,000 or $100 or whatever you like. But let's say that this is the situation, but we end up with a different GDP. Maybe it's GDP1. What if that happens? That be okay? Well, here's what would happen. If the GDP is GDP1, then we come up to the blue line here, the money supply line, and we say, well, we've got a $1,000 money supply. But we see money demand, and that's off of this upward sloping money demand line. We see that money demand is less than money supply. And it makes no difference how much these are. I'll put an amount in here, $900, but the dollar amount doesn't matter. What matters is that we see that if GDP, and this is the starting point for our discussion, if GDP is at some amount that I say is not equilibrium, but some other amount, then what I find is that the money supply is different than money demand. And I say, oh look, there's excess money supply, or sometimes said excess money balances, in the economy. Now if there's excess money balances, let's think about how that would work out, not in terms of some equation or a graph on the board, but let's think how it would work out in real life with real people. What would happen is something like this. You might have something in your mind, I like to keep $800 in my checking account. You might just kind of feel that way. I like to keep $800 in my checking, not just a checking account, maybe $700 in your checking account and $100 in cash in your pocket or back in your dorm room or your house or whatever. But you like to keep a money supply of $800 and $700 in a checking account and $100 in cash. And suppose that your bank statement comes today in the mail and you open it up and you're not thinking anything good or bad or anything, and you just open it up and you say, wow, would you look at that? I normally keep $700 in here and I've got $900 in my checking account. And I got the $100 in cash here that I normally keep, and so I've got a money supply, a personal money supply of $1,000. I used the wrong number here. Let me say $800, just to make it all go along with my example I'm making up. You normally like to keep, what did I say? Did I get? No, you like to have a money supply of $800 normally. That's just you. But in this particular case, you got $1,000 money supply. $900 in your checking account and $100 in cash. And then you start thinking, boy, this is such a nice day. That's what I always think. I think it's a nice day when there's a lot of money sort of sloshing around my checking account. And I also think how smart I must be, or else that money wouldn't be there. Right? That money didn't show up on its own. A smart guy put it there. So anyway, you get this statement and you start going, wow, I got a couple $100 extra. And then you start thinking things like, you know, maybe I'll call some friends up and we'll go out to a movie and to dinner tonight. Or maybe I'll buy that new shirt I've been wanting. Or maybe I'll have a new tire put on my car. I've needed a new tire for a while, but I've been driving around on that spare, and I think I'll get a new tire. But whatever happens, when there's excessive amounts of money in the economy, people get this little happy surprise when they open up their bank balance. And then they start saying, or their bank statement, then they start saying, I think I'm going to spend a little bit of this. So excess money supply, spend more. I mean, that's what that means. There's no law that says that. That's what people do. They just say, oh, I can afford that. And then they buy something that maybe a day before they wouldn't have bought. So when you spend more, then that shows up at the stores, grocery stores, department stores, and so forth, as extra sales revenue. That's at the stores. And then the stores do things like they hire more workers. Hire workers. Why? Well, people are coming in and buying stuff, and we need to have some more workers here. And then they also say, this is the retail stores, order more merchandise. And what's happening is that this excess money supply in the economy, when it gets spent, then the stores feel that coming in and start taking appropriate action, hiring workers, ordering merchandise, and then the manufacturers start hiring more workers. This is what we talk about is, what? GDP expands. Let's say grows, not expands. GDP grows. Let me say increases. That's a better word still. Increases. So what I'm saying to you is we started off with GDP 1, and now we just saw that if GDP is GDP 1, and we do have these excess money supply or excess money balances, then forces are set in motion that cause GDP to rise. And so this GDP 1 doesn't stay there at GDP 1, it's growing now. Why? Because of all this new spending. How long will it grow? And the answer is, it will grow until there's no more excess money supply. That's what we're trying to get rid of here, is the excess money supply. So as GDP starts to grow, then people start saying, I'd like to hold a little bit more money. And as they say, I'd like to hold a little bit more money, then the excess money supply gets a little smaller. And this forces a little bit less. And so basically what happens is GDP keeps growing until it's finally up to this equilibrium level, and then people don't say, I have excess money balances. Now when they get their bank statement in the mail, it says $700, you got the $100 in cash, you've got $800, that's what you, well, I'm sorry, it's the other way around, isn't it? But anyway, the money demand would grow. My example didn't go along with my graph. But money demand would grow until finally there would be no more excess money balances. And then people would not be spending more. They would be satisfied with the situation as it is, and we're here at equilibrium. Suppose that we started off here at GDP 2. How would that work out? And the answer is, oh, and that's our new starting point. Start here. If we have GDP 2, we have a very high level of national production and income. Okay, then here's what happens. People desire a large amount of money balances. At their high income, they're doing a lot of spending, they're buying a lot of things. There's a lot of economic activity. People need to hold a lot of money. Let's say I'll put $1,200 here just to work with an easy number. So if we started with GDP at 2, GDP 2, then we have a big money demand, quantity of money people would like to hold. The money supply is, in this particular case, $1,000. And so what we'd say is we have deficient money balances, or a deficient money supply. And in this particular case, somebody says, oh, or the average person, let's say, I like to keep $1,200 in money. personally on hand, either in my checking account or in my pocket. I like to hold on to $1,200 worth of money. And so then here comes the bank statement, and they open it up and they go, oh man, I'm a couple $100 below what I normally like to keep. So now people, the average persons, open up that bank statement and it's saying deficient money balances. And companies are doing the same thing. And then they say, oh boy, I'm $200 under. And it's kind of this little embarrassing feeling that you might have, only you know, but you're still kind of shocked into action. And you go, what am I going to do? I'm $200 low. I'll tell you what I do when I'm $200 low. I put on a ski mask and go to, no, I don't really go to the get and go. When my bank balance is a little bit low, I think something like this. Gosh, I wish I had another $200 to get me up to the normal amount. Oh, if I would cut my spending by $50 a month, just cut back a little bit, $50 a month, a little over $1 a day, then in 4 months, my bank balance would have built up to what I normally like to keep. $50 a month. I don't have to solve this problem overnight, just a little bit at a time. So the person cuts back on spending. Deficient money balances reduce spending to increase money balances. How'd you like that ski mask approach though in the get and go? That's really illegal. I don't know if anybody told you that. Anyway, so what we do here is, in order to build up our bank account to where we like it to be, we just get a little bit frugal. We don't have to go nuts. This doesn't have to be done in one day, but we're going to cut back on our spending a little bit. And when we do, there will be reduced sales revenues by retailers. And when retailers see these reduced sales revenues coming in, they will, let's say, lay off some workers. Lay off workers. Or maybe all they do is they just say no more overtime. Or maybe what they do is when somebody retires or quits, they don't replace them. But somehow or another they say we're not selling as much and we just don't need as many employees to handle fewer customers. And then reduce merchandise orders. And that goes on back to the manufacturer, and then all of a sudden GDP declines. And so we started off with GDP 2, but all of a sudden now it's declining. And why is that? Because people are trying to accumulate money. You see, there's a big problem with that, accumulating money. Suppose that I'm trying to get an extra $200 into my checking account or into my pocket, and you're trying to get an extra $200 into your checking account or your pocket, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person. The thing is that we can't do that. Well, I mean, we can all want to do that. I can want $200 more, but where am I going to get it? I can't print it up. The only place for me to get an extra $200 is from somebody else. But the thing is other people are trying to accumulate their own $200, and the only place they can get that is from somebody else, like me. And so there's really not enough, another $200 to go around for everybody, and we're all just kind of cutting back on our spending, and that's going to cause the economy to slow down. And when it does slow down, we're moving from GDP 2 back to the equilibrium. And as we see this happen, as the economy does slow down, GDP starts to drop back, then people don't want to hold so much money anymore. A moment ago they wanted $1,200, this average person, but as their incomes go down, and what they're saying here is, I want 20% as much money balance as whatever my annual income is. As people's income goes down, then their desired money demand goes down. And so finally, GDP has fallen all the way back to equilibrium. Their money demand has fallen all the way back down to $1,000, and we've achieved an equilibrium. So anyway, what I am saying to you is this, is that the modern quantity theory of money is, first of all, they use that equation of exchange for money demand, and then they go ahead and set up this sort of equilibrium condition of money demand equals money supply. And then basically what they say is, anytime there's a disagreement between money demand and money supply, this thing down here on the horizontal axis, nominal GDP, that will adjust. And so really what this group says is that the quantity of money in the economy will determine GDP, nominal GDP. Okay. Are there questions about this, what we've just covered? Because we've covered quite a bit here. But on the other hand, it's not all that complicated. This is just one more sort of graphical representation of how the economy operates. Let's see if I can find out where I am here in my notes. Yeah, I see where we are. Okay. Any questions about this? What we want to do next is we want to talk about shifting these curves. Shifting curves. Here's where we just were in this discussion. We showed where the equilibrium GDP is, and if we start off with a different level of GDP, we will move to that equilibrium. So that is the equilibrium, and so GDP will remain at this point for a long, long time unless something changes. And what would change is the money demand curve would shift, rotate, or the money supply curve would shift. Until that happens, if we don't have these curves shifting, then we just stay at this point. This is our equilibrium situation. We remain in that spot. Okay, so let's suppose something does come along and change. How could the money supply curve shift? Well, this would only happen through Fed policy. Right? And we talked about the Federal Reserve the other day and how it had those three main policies. If you remember, it has open market operations to influence the money supply. It can change the discount rate to influence the money supply, or it could change reserve requirements to affect the money supply. But those, the Fed policies, there are three Fed policies that could affect the money supply. And so anyway, one of those policies could change. Okay, so let's let one of these policies change. Let's let the money supply increase money supply from $1,000 to $1,500. Let's just do that in this diagram here. Let me put a 1 next to that, and this will be when our money supply is $1,000, and in a second I'll increase that. We'll let this equal 0.2. Let me ask you a question here. How much is this GDP, this equilibrium GDP? Does anybody know? How could we figure that out? Here's what we know, is that at this point, at the equilibrium GDP, money supply equals money demand. And we know what the money supply is. It's equal to, and this is our equilibrium condition, it's equal to $1,000. So $1,000 money supply equals money demand, which is 0.2 times GDP. Now, how much would GDP have to be? And this is just our equilibrium condition of money supply equals money demand. How much would GDP have to be in order for this to be a true statement? $5,000. And by the way, you could have done it this way. It's $1,000. What would it be divided by 0.2, right? Equals $5,000. Anyway, what I'm saying to you is that GDP, equilibrium GDP in this particular case is $5,000. Okay, now what we want to do is we've got a Fed policy. The Fed either buys government securities, or it lowers the discount rate, or it lowers the reserve ratio. And so the money supply goes up. In this particular case, we're going to increase the money supply to $1,500. 0.2 equals $1,500. Okay, now, and I know that everybody can see this new point of equilibrium, and we'll get there in a second, but don't jump there right away. Here's what I want you to think about. You know, you don't keep all these curves up here. What happened was there's only one money supply at any point in time. It used to be 1,000, but now that's gone, and now it's $1,500. And so I've almost erased this thing because we just don't want to be thinking about it, but I want to refer to it again, so I don't want it to be totally gone. I just want it to be kind of beat up and almost forgotten. Okay, so here's the situation we're in. We've already been through one of these points. At the original GDP that we're starting at, we have a certain money demand. Here's our money demand line. Here's GDP is $5,000. So money demand is equal to $1,000 in this particular case. And in this particular case, money supply is equal to $1,500. And we already went over this before in our old diagram when I was showing you how do we get to equilibrium. I was saying, well, what if money supply and money demand are not equal? We're in one of those situations. Money supply and money demand are not equal. All of a sudden, money supply went up, and there's an inequality. At the original GDP where we start here, at the original GDP, there's money demand is 0.2 times $5,000 is 1,000. Money supply is $1,500, so we have excess money balances. And I won't go through all the details again, at least I won't write them down, but I'll say them. Excess money balances, people feel like I can afford to take a little vacation, or I can afford to put that new tire on my car or whatever. Excess money balances result in extra spending, and then GDP starts to rise. More people get jobs and so forth. And so we see this original equilibrium GDP of $5,000, that starts to increase. Increase in GDP. How far? Well, out to this point. GDP, I'll put a 2 next to that. How much is that GDP? GDP 2. Let's go back to the formula that we worked with a while ago. We have money supply equals money demand. That has to be true for us to reach an equilibrium, and that's what has happened here as we've reached equilibrium. That has to be true. This is $1,500, money supply, equals 0.2 times GDP. That's our equilibrium condition. This is the money demand equation, is 0.2 GDP. And then we could, if you like, divide by 0.2, 0.2. These cancel, so it says GDP, this is the equilibrium GDP, equals, really this is like multiplying by 5, $7,500. Questions about this? It's really pretty straightforward, and here's the math to sort of figure your way out of, figure your way to the equilibrium. Where is equilibrium? Let me erase, and we'll do one in the other direction. Suppose the Federal Reserve cuts the money supply, reduces it. This is at K, or 1 over V. That's the 0.2. Money supply, let's start off again, $1,000. And then we'll put in equilibrium, $5,000, GDP, I'll put in a 1 there. Now, let's suppose the Federal Reserve cuts the money supply from $1,000 to, let's say, $800. MS2 equals $800. Again, let's erase. There's only one money supply, and it happens to now be $1,000 or $800. So if that's the case, we start off here, this is our beginning point. GDP was $5,000 to begin with. When GDP is $5,000 and people want to hold 20% as much money balances as their incomes, then money demand is 0.2 times $5,000 equals, people would like to hold $1,000 money demand. They actually do hold money supply equals $800. So if there's money demand greater than money supply, we say there are deficient money balances. If there are deficient money balances, we went through this before, people will reduce their spending. Companies will have lower receipts, they'll lay off employees, they'll reduce their purchases of new merchandise, and so forth, and so there will be a decrease in GDP. And this could either be a reduction in the price level or a reduction in the quantity of production. It could be either one, and it could be both. It's just we know GDP goes down. Whether it's the nominal or the real part, we haven't really got any answer to at this point. That's not part of what we're trying to accomplish right now. So anyway, GDP goes down. Well, yeah, it goes down to this point here where money supply again equals to as money demand. Our equilibrium condition, money supply equals money demand, that's the equilibrium condition. Money supply in this particular case is $800 equals 0.2 times GDP, again divide by 0.2. These cancel, GDP, this is the new equilibrium, is equal to, that's really 5 times 800, $4,000. End. That's our new destination point. Any questions about this? Really, the graph is not the important thing, although it's nice if you can manipulate the graph or if you understand it. The important thing is this, is that we understand this chain of reasoning that runs from, well, if we have deficient money balances, that's when you go and get your bank statement and you have less in your account than you normally would like to have. And then you say, how could I adjust that? And the answer is cut back on my spending just a little bit. And then you think about the grocery stores and the discount stores, how they cut back on their purchases and so forth. That's the important thing for you to understand how we're going to end up at this new lower level of GDP. And being able to draw the graph, I can draw the graph, but you know, there's not a place on the test for you to do that. And so it's great if you can use the graph to reason your way to this, but drawing the graph isn't really the point of it. It's thinking about the sort of logical step. And by the way, the term analysis just refers to breaking something complex down into small pieces and understanding those pieces. And that's all we're doing here is we're conducting an analysis of monetary policy, and so we see the money supply go down, and then what we want to know is what are those small steps connecting us from the starting point to the ending point in our analysis. And the steps are, well, number one, now money supply is less than money demand. And next is we cut back our spending, and then the stores respond, and so on. And so we go through this whole chain of logic to then come to the final point, which is the new GDP is going to be less. Any questions about that? This is how would Fed policy affect GDP. We need to talk about something else. Shifts in either one of these curves, we just took up money supply, shifts in either one of these curves would cause our equilibrium GDP to change. So now we want to talk about what would shift the money demand line or the money demand curve. Okay, let's do a little erasing and talk about that a bit. First of all, our formula, money demand equals K times GDP. This K right here is kind of special. It's really the thing that's driving this whole money demand. Let's put it like this. I'll divide both sides by GDP, so it's MD over GDP equals K. This K right here is really showing us the strength of money demand. How much money do you want to hold relative to your income? Let me give you an example. Suppose your income's $20,000, and the typical person's income is $20,000. If that were the case, then multiply by all the people, and that would give us GDP. So anyway, suppose that the average per capita person's income is $20,000, and that average person likes to keep money balances of, let's say, to make it easy, $2,000. Then what we're saying is this K would equal 0.1. If this were $4,000, it would be 0.2, and you get the idea. So anyway, the point is that this K is showing us the strength of money demand. Okay? And the K says that money demand is proportional to incomes or economic activity, but the bigger that number, then the bigger the proportion. If this number is 0.3, I really want to hold a lot of money. 0.3 times 20,000, I want to hold $6,000 worth of money. 0.1, I only want 2,000. So anyway, that K is showing us the strength of our money demand. And I'm just sort of mentioning that because it's K that will change. Let me draw this curve again. GDP and money. Let's draw two of these. MD equals 0.1 times GDP. And MD equals 0.2 times GDP. What you can see is this, is that the stronger the money demand is, the higher that curve goes. Strong money demand, I really want to hold a lot of money. And let's do it this way. And I just did this a moment ago, but let's say that income's $10,000. I'm saying in this one case you want to hold with the first line, let me give these numbers 1 and 2. With the first money demand line, before it rotated upward, we wanted to hold 10% of $10,000. I wanted $1,000 in money balances. Okay? And now in this new case, I want $2,000 worth of money balances. So when the curve rotates upwards, that reflects a higher K value. This is K1, K2. And all we're talking about with the K is the strength of money demand. Okay, so here's the question. What would increase money demand? Why does money demand increase? One thing which I do not want to say will shift the curve, but which moves us along the curve, is if there's a change, let's say an increase in GDP and income, then we move along the curve. From one point to another. And that is not what we're looking at for here. If our GDP rose and our average income rose, we would move along this curve and we would want more money, but that is not a shift in the curve, that's a movement along the curve. So that is definitely not what we're talking about here. What would cause people to desire more money balances? Let me give you 3 things, and you can think of more, but 3 are, I think, enough to illustrate the idea. First of all, reduced interest rate on, let's say, bonds and savings accounts. Here's what's going on. You've got a portfolio of financial wealth. You have, I have, everybody has. We've got a portfolio of financial wealth. One of the things in our portfolio is money, but something else might be bonds, and something else might be savings accounts. That's just an example. And you can imagine, let me just put percents out here. Let's say that in the first instance, this is 40% of my portfolio, the bonds are 30%, and then the savings account's 30%. That's out of 100%. Okay. Now what I'm saying is this, if interest rates on bonds and savings accounts come down, bonds and savings accounts aren't quite as lucrative as they used to be. And if they're not quite as lucrative as they used to be, then what I'm likely to say is something like, man, bonds and savings accounts, you know, I'm not too wild about those. I think I'm going to lower my holdings of those things now that they are a little bit less rewarding. And I'll hold more of other assets. Oh, look, money. And so the idea is if interest rates come down, then what we tend to see is larger money balances and smaller balances in some of these other financial assets. And so what we were trying to understand is what would increase money demand? And the answer is, well, if interest rates on bonds and savings accounts, alternative investments, if the yields on those came down, we'd hold more money. How about this? If the stock market crashed and people just said, man, it's going to crash tomorrow and the next day and you just cannot make money in the stock market. If that was the case, people would sell their stocks and hold some money. Money is a store of value. You remember those three functions performed by money. The third is money is a store of value. And that's all we're saying here is people will hold more money if interest rates are lower. Okay? How about a second thing that would cause people to hold more money balances would be a reduction in the inflation rate. A reduced inflation rate. Now, in order to explain this one, let me go at it sort of in a backward direction, as I do so many things. Let me go at that in sort of a backward direction, because we've talked about this before. What I told you earlier was this, is if there is inflation, if prices are going up, then the inflation taxes, basically, your money balances. I gave the example, suppose I've got $10 in my pocket. And I go to the, Hardee's or someplace like that, and hamburgers are $1 a piece. The $10 in my pocket will buy me 10 hamburgers. Suppose then there's inflation and prices go up and they double. I've still got $10 in my pocket, but now hamburgers are not $1 a piece, they're $2 a piece now that prices have doubled. And so now my $10, which used to buy 10 hamburgers, now will only buy 5 hamburgers. And so when I was holding money, if prices go up, my money will buy less, my money balances are being taxed. I'm being punished for holding money. Well, now I want to turn that around, and it goes in the opposite direction. If the inflation rate comes down, or if prices were to go down, then what would happen is I would be rewarded for holding money. And we talked earlier on when we were talking about the aggregate demand curve, the real balance effect. Suppose prices come down. I've got $10 in my pocket. It will buy, originally will buy 10 hamburgers. And suppose the price of hamburgers actually went down from $1 a piece, and I'll just say to 50 cents a piece. Now this $10 in my pocket will buy 20 hamburgers. I've been rewarded for holding money in my pocket. So anyway, if there's a reduced inflation rate, then people are more willing to hold money. They are less subject to that inflation tax on their money balances. Okay? And by the way, later on we'll come back and say, why did money demand decrease? It would decrease because, I don't want to hold money balances if there's more inflation. But now we're talking about the opposite. There's less inflation. How about this possibility, why you'd hold more money balances? If people are paid once a month rather than once a week as previously. That is to say, suppose that your employer increases the period of time between paychecks. If you're getting paid once a week, maybe you get paid, let's say, $200 a week. Okay? And you take this $200 out and kind of spend it over the course of the week, and your average holdings of money is, well, like if you start off with $200 at the start of the week and you spend that all down by the end of the week, you went from 200 to 0, and on average you were holding about $100. Suppose instead that your employer pays you once a month and pays you $800 at the start of the month. 4 weeks, $200 per week. So you get $800 and then you spend that down from $800 down to 0. First of the month to the end of the month you go from 800 to 0, but on average you're holding $400 in currency. Well, not currency, but money. Could be currency, could be checking account money. But the less often you get paid, the more you're going to hold in that bank account on average. So these are 3 different examples of what would cause people to hold more money. Let's draw the graph to go along with that. I better leave that up there. No, I don't need that there. Let's draw the graph to go along with an increase in money demand. This will produce maybe surprising results. Maybe you won't be surprised, but I always kind of find it surprising. Here's our MD1 equals K1 times GDP, and we'll let this equal 0.1. And we'll increase money demand. MD2 equals K2 times GDP. And we'll let that equal 0.2. Put in our money supply line, MS, and I'll put a bar over that. We're not going to change that here in this example. Here's what we have. We start off with GDP equilibrium, GDP1. How much is that? Oh, I didn't tell you this, did I? Let's say $1,000. 0.1 times $10,000 would equal, yeah, that works out, $10,000. If money demand goes up, what we're saying is GDP would go down in this particular case to $5,000. Let me say it in words. Well, I mean, I've been saying words, but let me say it in slightly different words. Here's what I'm saying to you is if we start off at the original equilibrium point, money supply equals money demand, and then something happens, well, I don't know what, but something happens and causes people to desire more money, then we start doing this. We say, oh, I like to have a little bit more money in my bank account. I'm going to cut back on my spending a little bit. And so when people start cutting back on their spending, that's when GDP will start to fall. And not until I am holding the amount of money, here's the money supply, not until I'm holding the amount I'd like to hold, not until we get back to here, will I be satisfied with my money balances. So an increase in money demand will cause a decrease in GDP. We already saw this. A decrease in the money supply would have caused a decrease in GDP. So in terms of how is GDP affected, it's affected the same either by a tight monetary policy, a contractionary policy, one that reduces money supply. That has the same effect on GDP as if people wanted to hold more money. Their money demand went up. I think that would be a good place to stop for the day, and we'll pick up with this next time. So long.